Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the Fleer basketball sets of the 1980s. I'm going to get a little bit long-winded in this video simply because there's not a lot to talk about with each one of these sets because there are basically just 2 or 3 cards from each set to talk about, but also because this is an important time for the development of the modern basketball card. This is really the beginning of it, and you're able to see the growth into the beginning of the true budding of the card industry in basketball as we know it. So it's an interesting time to look at, and it's also kind of helpful to understand just how primitive and how unique that particular time is that we look back kind of fondly at simply because of the rookie cards that were showing up and the fact that there was no competition. And the fact that there was no competition is what's really interesting about this. Basketball was a market that was difficult to grab hold. Hockey had a very, very secure market, and it was able to take advantage of that, but it was very regional. It was in Canada, and it was in basically the Northeast and the Upper Midwest. That's really the only place where hockey worked, but it was a rock-solid audience. With basketball, it was actually a national experience, and so it was much more broadly understood, but as far as a core market goes, there was no market for the cards, and so Topps made a run at it, didn't work. Fleer made a run at it, didn't work. Topps jumped back into it, got 13 sets done over the whole 70s, and then they had to walk away again. And so there was a weird time span where a little company called Star was the only company that could actually get away with making basketball cards. Other than that, it was a market that could never really grab hold. Fleer was in a unique situation in the 1980s because prior to the 80s, they'd made a little run at making cards, but they couldn't really break into the market too well, primarily because of the stranglehold that Topps had, until the early 80s when they were finally able to get back into baseball and actually make some secure card sets that were able to sustain over the years. And so now they were back in the market. However, they were also there with Topps and with Don Russ, so there wasn't a lot of elbow room. So they needed to have something that was all their own, and fortunately for them, basketball was wide open, so in 1986 they decided to jump into basketball and basically make cards where nobody else was making cards. And it was a great time for them to do it because the sport was just starting to kind of build up its audience a little bit more. It was starting to become a sport that people were more aware of. You had the Larry Bird and Magic Johnson pairing, and then you had Michael Jordan, who was just starting to emerge. People were just starting to hear his name, and so he was this interesting name that people were beginning to take notice of. So right when Fleer got into the market, the sport itself was becoming a national conversation. Not a big conversation, but it was becoming a conversation. So they were at the right spot to be there at the foundation, and they were able to ride it all the way in, which was good. 486, in their attempt to jump in this market and make it work, they needed to start off with a card that had all of the power to really be able to be noticeable. In baseball, they were making more of a staid card. It was kind of cutting edge, but it wasn't flashy. Don Russ was making flashy, Topps was making kind of flashy, but Fleer was trying to make just a really solid and very appealing card. That was the approach they were taking. Well, here they needed to make something that was flashy, that grabbed people's eyes, in order to create a market. And so for the 86-87 set, that's exactly what they did. They made a card that used red, white, and blue, so the 3 patriotic colors. And then they used horizontal banding on this card in order to create some really interesting dynamism, which actually worked really well. And then they were smart enough to use the really good action shots that basketball is so well known for. This was an important move because in football and in baseball, the card industry tended to use portraits. That was just the de facto approach that they took. You make a portrait shot because in football, obviously, you have to do it because of the helmets. In baseball, the players are a little bit too far away. But in basketball, Fleer was smart enough to say, no, we're going to make action shots. And that was the right move for them to make. If they'd done portraits, the cards wouldn't have inspired people in terms of really bringing them into the sport proper. So that was what they needed to do. They needed to get people excited about the sport, and the card that they created was exactly that. It can look a little dated now, but at the time, it really was a cutting-edge card. So that was a great move. Now on the card back, it's basically a red and white back with some blue text on it. I actually think it's a pretty good card back. It's not too dynamic, but it was enough. It was what they needed to do. And so this card worked for being a really good introduction into the league. And the way that they laid out the cards in the set was alphabetical. So normally you do it either by team or random. Well, here they actually did it alphabetically. So they start off with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and they end with James Worthy, which doesn't sound to me like they've made a lot of progress, but that is the way that the set is made, which is interesting. And they would do this both for this year and for the next year. But because they didn't have to compete with Topps, in this sport, they could do anything they want, so they decided to use the stickers for player cards. So they actually had an insert set of not all stars, but it's basically all pros. These are the star players of the league, and these are sticker cards. And that was a neat thing they were able to do for an insert set. So they were able to do something similar to what Topps was doing in the other sports. The cards themselves are very poorly designed. It's basically just a stripped down one side that really looks more like a 1981 Fleer card than it does a 1986 Fleer card. But you know, that's what they went with, but at least the images did tend to look pretty good. And then on the card back, it was basically a take on the main set card back, just without stats. Instead, they had a big write-up. So that was the design that they went with, and it was a pretty good start. Now, they did overproduce it a little bit. That's kind of what you do. You put out a bunch of cards, and then you find out where the market is. So in 87, 88, when they came back for their second set, they were able to pare the production down a little bit more to fit better with the market. So the 87, 88 cards are a little harder to come by than the 86, 87, or the 86, 87 cards are a lot easier to come by than people really realize. But 86 has all the rookies, so that's the set that everybody focuses on. So for 87, 88, they did another take on the same idea. Now, in the previous year, they had done a border on the inside and then a big action shot. Well, here they decided instead to strip it down to where on the outside you just have some border elements, and then there's no transition between the two. You basically just have a shot right in the middle. And the shots are basically portraits at this point. So they're getting more focused in on just a clear shot of the player instead of having all the action, which, you know, it works fine. But it wasn't really necessary to get the action in these cards because you already had that in the previous year. It basically introduced you to the market. The card border itself still uses the horizontal lines, but here they just use gray lines, and they took almost all the color out, but not all of it, because they did put the team name in the team colors from one color to the other, and that creates a rich amount of energy on the card front, which was a really good complement to how the whole card was designed. So this is a really well designed card. It's not that exciting, but it is a very calm and staid card design. On the card back here, they actually used a three-tone card back. The whole card back itself is a lot more lively in terms of color. I don't like it as much, but they were getting a little bit better in terms of their overall card design approach. They were refining these cards. For the Fleer sticker all-star cards, the insert cards, here they actually did do a card design. So that was a really good addition that they made. And the card design is very energetic, very lively. It's not a great card design, but it really jumps out. It really makes a big statement. And here we have the red, white, and blue again. And here they go even beyond that. They actually literally have stars and stripes on the card. I mean, I don't know that any other card has been this patriotic. So it was a really interesting move that they made. And then on the card back, again, they did a similar thing to what they'd done the previous year, where it's kind of a take on the main cards in the set, except this is basically all in blue. So they still had no competition, so they're basically competing with themselves. So they were basically taking every year and just making a variation on it, which was a really good move for them to be making. I like that approach. And so for 88, 89, they made a card that, in my opinion, is one of the great all-time card fronts. Here, they didn't bother with the stripes themselves. They instead went with a color fade, which is more of a 90s thing, but it was nice that they added it into this card. But they did it with kind of the stripe-like fashion, where they have a horizontal black band in the middle that fades into white on the top and on the bottom. But the card design is not about that. In fact, you don't even notice the fade, because the whole point of this card is an inset border that has the two colors of the team. One on the top, one on the bottom. And as they transition through the middle, that's where the fade in between transitions your eye for both of them. And one of the advantages that a fade provides is that it causes your eye to move. Even if your eye doesn't move, it causes your mind to move through the design. So it creates energy in the card, it creates movement in the card. And that way, on the top you have one color, on the bottom you have a whole nother color, and yet that fade creates this whole path through the card that makes the top and the bottom jump out, but at the same time it makes them unified, and it causes your eye to travel around the card and explore it. It's an incredible thing that they did, and it really, like I said, it is one of the all-time great card fronts. So this was kind of the highlight for Fleer, and I think it is the all-time card for Fleer designs. And Ultra also got really good down the road, but for Fleer proper, I think that there's absolutely no competition for this card. So this was great. And the way that the teams look is kind of interesting because different teams are better benefited or more adversely impacted by this trick. So like the Jazz has green and purple, which is kind of a weird combination. It doesn't really look very good. But if there's one team that is benefited by this, it's the Chicago Bulls, and it's as if the entire card set was designed around these cards. They look great. This is really the standard bearer for this card, just in terms of how the cards look. The card back it's a better card back, but it's not as interesting, and it's more interesting. Basically, they were still learning how to improve these cards, and this shows that they were making a lot of progress, but they still had to really work out how you experience the card back. So this may look good, but it's not interesting. And then for this year, they finally got around to setting the set up based on teams. So it's no longer alphabetical, it's based on teams. And then at the end of the set, they made a subset. And this subset is All-Stars. So this is an opportunity to show action shots. So that's a great addition that they made. And then on the backs of these cards, instead of doing a write-up, they actually have league statistics. So you're able to see who the league leaders are in different statistical categories. So that was a nice thing that they threw in as well, because instead of doing league leader cards, they were able to combine that with all-star cards and do action shots all at the same time. So that was a great development. Then for their stickers, they did an improvement on the cards, and yet they also kind of fell back in a bit. So prior to this, the images tended to stand out a little bit more. Here, the image kind of gets lost in this well-designed but not well-built card border. And that's the problem with these cards, is that the card border, it doesn't have its own interest. It has too much stuff going on, so it doesn't grab anything, and then the picture just kind of gets lost because it's a little bit fuzzy, it's not well chosen. And so these stickers, it shows that well, on the main set they'd figured it out. Here they had a long way to go. So that was the last year that Fleer would basically own basketball. Starting with the next year, they would actually get a little bit of competition from NBA Hoops. So Hoops was a really good addition to the whole card industry, in part because they were able to motivate Fleer in the right way. The cards that Hoops made were well designed, but they also had limitations. I'll get into that in a minute. But for right now, Fleer wasn't competing with NBA Hoops because Hoops wasn't out yet. So Fleer was still making kind of a take on the things they'd been doing. And here the card is kind of like a retro card. Now, I started in the industry the year after, and when I did, these cards were only a year old, and I knew they were only a year old, but they always felt like retro cards. In fact, I've always thought that these cards look a lot like the 1979 Topps football set. So the cards do have a retro look, and I think that they were going by their 1960s set. That I think that was the theme that was kind of inspiring it. But the cards, while they do look kind of retro, they also are very strong, and the design is really good. They have a really good border. It's a very bold border, but it's very simplified. And the weight of the color does a really good job of reading with the images. And the images are looking pretty good here in this set, just like they had in the previous few years. The logo for the team looks really good. And the way the white border is around the outside, I think is a really good complement. So I think that all of the pieces are right. Is it as good as the previous year? No, it doesn't need to be, because it really is a good card. And then if you turn it over on the card back, the card back's starting to look a lot better, because now they're actually starting to use the real estate right. They're actually putting in some writing. Prior to this, it had only been statistics, so that was a bit of a limitation. But here, while the card itself, the card back is not designed as well as it was in the previous year, all of the things in it are a lot better. So it's a nice balance between the two. And then again in the set, they did the subset of the All-Stars. But here, they showed pairings of basically teammates is the big thing. So If they had all-stars that were on the same team, two guys, then they'd put them together on the card. And as you can see, Fleer was very forward-thinking in putting Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler in the same card. This was just because both of them had no teammate for this set, so they were thrown together. But on the back, there's a really big write-up. It's really good, where they have a big write-up that talks about the players. So I like that addition for this set. It would have been nice to see action shots on the front like they'd done the previous year, but still, the cards did look pretty good. And then for the All-Star Stickers set here, this is kind of the highlight for the All-Star Stickers. This is kind of the high point it would get to. The whole border is really lively, and it's really well designed. It has a nice fade in it. It has a bunch of interesting elements that stand out pretty clearly. The image is looking a little bit better, so that's also a good thing. So overall, the card's not perfect, but it is a huge improvement over what they'd been doing prior to that. But like I said, now they had competition with NBA Hoops, and because of that, NBA Hoops was now going to be something that they were going to be looking at to try to figure out their path forward. Hoops was not a brilliantly designed card. It was an okay design card. The problem was they had a big white border around the outside, and that really hampered the potential for the card. But the big strength to Hoops was not the front, although the images were great. It was on the back. It was that great color photo on the back. That was something that was very new, having color photos. Now, photos have been done for years in baseball. In fact, Fleer had even done photos on cards, but they were, black and white images. They were terrible. Here, they were actually making quality images, just like Pro Set was in football. And so that meant that the card back had to be a lot better moving forward. Fleer knew this, but also the whole nature of the card, Fleer had to up the game. So they've been using really good designs for just energetic designs. Well, now they wanted to start thinking about the design, and I think that's the big problem. 1990 is the terrible year for Fleer cards. Excuse me, it's the first terrible year for Fleer cards. Across the whole board, every set was terrible in 1990. And I think that basketball was the best of the three, but that's not saying a lot. The basketball cards are too overly designed, and yet it was not designed with an aesthetic in mind. This is the kind of thing that you punch into a computer and you let the computer create whatever you told it to make. It should work. It's got all the pieces that it needs to work. It's just that they didn't notice the things that needed to be addressed. So first off, instead of having a pure white card, it's got a little bit of an eggshell quality to the color, slightly yellowish. So that's already a bit of a problem. And then the colors for the team, they're not strong. And so nothing is overpowering the white. And because of that, that means you have just this big white field around the image, and then there's nothing to correspond to inside the image to make the image pop out, which means that the image just becomes one big blur of a box. You can't really see the player inside. And then they still have the red, white, and blue element in terms of having this inner border with red and blue that just, I don't think it worked very well. And as a result of all of this, these cards don't make a personal statement. They never look interesting. I remember at the time trying to figure out why Fleer thought that they could make, I didn't know anything about Fleer. I looked at that and I thought that they were like some second-rate company that were just kind of churning out the cards. These were the cheap cards. These were truly the cheap cards. To me, these were the ones that I thought of as what you get in a supermarket. The card back was good in terms of all the stuff they had, but it was too bold. It was screaming at the top of its lungs. The card was just, it was very limited in whatever potential it might have. And I believe that it's because they were so busy trying to craft a great card that they forgot to just make a great card. They also didn't make anything interesting in the set. There was no subset. It was just a straightforward group of players. They had a couple of checklists at the back. They also had an update set that was sold later on that was also just straightforward cards. So there was nothing even in the set to be interesting. The only things that were interesting were the inserts, and fortunately, plural. And so they still had their all-star sticker cards, and I happen to like these cards because I remember at the time how cool they looked and the fact that I could actually get my hands on them. So that was, there's a personal appreciation that I have for it. But it's not as good as the previous year, although the image is looking a lot better. But the big card from this set was the Rookie Sensations cards. And these cards they're very blocky, they're also screaming at you, but What's interesting about these cards is that at that time, we still weren't very used to insert cards. So insert cards were a rare treat. And specifically, the card you're looking at, David Robinson, this was one of the great chase cards of this time. David Robinson had technically had a rookie card the previous year in NBA Hoops. He actually had two. But in 1990, we weren't sure if that was really the rookie card or if that was like an ex-rookie, and then all the cards in 1990 were the rookies. And for us, we treated both as rookies. We treated the 89 as more of an exotic card that you could go out and discover, whereas in 1990, we really were treating those like his rookie cards. And this was the card for David Robinson for 1990. Hoops also had an interesting one, but this one just carried a little bit more. There was something really fascinating about it. So in 1990, the chase cards were obviously the Bo Jackson football baseball, there was the Pro Set hologram, and then there was this David Robinson rookie sensation cards. Those were the three cards that were really significant from the hobby in 1990. So it was a really cool card in that regard. Well designed? No, but it did its job for Fleer. It got people interested in Fleer, and this was a set, an insert set that they would continue for years. But at this point, they were going to have to make a huge transition. They had been writing pretty well on just being the card in the hobby, but now they had too much competition, and they had to get back to what they were doing before, only to do it better. So I'm going to look at 91, 92, and on in future videos. This is what I'm going to be looking at just here, just looking at the growth of the Fleer market of cards in basketball and looking at the early stages of basketball cards. So definitely stay tuned for the other videos coming up for Fleer down the road, and I'll be getting into hoops and skybox and all that as well. So definitely subscribe if you haven't done so already to check out for my other videos. And I hope that you've learned something about this. It's definitely an interesting time in cards, primarily because of how almost nothing was going on at this time, and then so quickly it became a huge market. But other than that, thank you very much for watching.